Alrighty, welcome to this episode of Lectures with Liddington. We just wrapped up microscopes, learning how to use a microscope, because ultimately, before we could understand cells, we had to be able to see them, right? So we had to hone our microscopes and our technologies to be able to see those cells so that we could understand them. Without seeing them, there's just no way we're going to be able to understand them. So we had our microscopes, we used those in order to see things. So now let's get into cells. And a great place to start is what we call the cell theory. So in order to talk about cell theory, there are three main principles or statements, tenets, if you will, of the cell theory. So we'll start there, and then we'll talk about some of the scientists involved in helping come up with these three principles. So there are three, as I mentioned. Cells are the basic units of life. They're the bits and pieces that make up living things. So just like atoms are the basic units of matter, cells are the basic units of living things. All living things are composed of cells. Go back to characteristics of life, right? One of those characteristics is that they're made up of cells. And the last of these principles is that cells only come from previously existing cells. They don't just poof, show up. There has to be a cell previously in order to make new cells. So the OG when it came to cells and cell theory was a man named Robert Hooke. And he was a monk. And while he was studying in the monastery, he was very curious man. And what he did was he collected samples of cork. He sliced them and he put them on his microscope. And what he noticed were these tiny little sort of rectangles of what seemed like emptiness. In the cork, they were emptiness. But these little boxes, these little rectangles of emptiness. And they reminded him of the cells in the monastery, the little rooms that they lived in, very, very basic rooms that they lived in the monastery. And so he said, I'm going to call these things cells. The thing that's interesting is we think of cork, like cork boards and things like that. We think of them as just a thing, but they're actually used to be a plant. They're a dead living thing. They used to be living. So when he saw these samples, he said, I see those little rectangles. I'm going to call these things cells. So there it begins. So as we move along, there was a man, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he was curious about water and what was in it. He didn't necessarily set out per se to find living things, but what he did was he collected samples from pond water, which if you just look at it might seem kind of not exciting. But when he looked under the microscope, what he saw was this, abundance of little tiny things that were like wiggling around under the microscope. So in this water, what he found were microorganisms, tiny little single-celled or just very small multicellular organisms. You can call them microorganisms. So he discovered that these unicellular organisms, or very, very teeny tiny things, existed and said, hey, there are single-celled organisms. There's living stuff in this pond. If we keep going, so Leeuwenhoek's looking at microorganisms that are in the water. We've got this botanist. Botanists study plants. Schleiden was a man who was also very curious. He studied plants, and what he did was he took samples from lots of different plants and lots of different sections of them. He looked at leaves and roots and flowers and seeds, all different components of the plant. And what he noticed is no matter what piece and no matter what plant, hey, there are these cell things in all of my samples. So he went ahead and said, based off of what I'm seeing, all plants are composed of cells. Next comes another man, I guess not next. They were studying sort of concurrently around the same time. I guess colleagues sort of, they weren't researching with each other, but they were researching around the same time frame. And Schwann was not a botanist. He wasn't a fan of plants. He loved animals. So he studied different animal samples. He looked at tissues from all different organisms that were all animals. He swabbed cheek cells. He looked at cheek cells. He looked at different kinds of animals. He looked at different kinds of tissue, skin, liver, lung, heart, things like that. And every time he put those samples under the microscope, he said, hey, I see cells. So he went ahead and said, all animals are composed of cells. Put those three together, we've covered like all of the kingdoms. Plant kingdom, animal kingdom, your unicellular organisms, your protists, fungi. Some of them are unicellular and some of them are multicellular. But we've covered all these different types of organisms, the major kingdoms. Hey, they're all made of cells. Along comes Virchow, Rudolf Virchow. He was actually not so much a scientist just for science, I guess. He was a physician, so a doctor, and he not only helped patients, but he also did research at the same time. And when he was in practice, at the time, we didn't really understand cells. So they thought there were these weird like fluids in the body or whatever, and that imbalances made you sick. But he discovered that disease came from within the cells. He found diseased cells with things like bacteria and fungus that were growing on those cells. And what he realized in a bunch of his studies was all these new cells have to come from previously existing cells. That was sort of his big takeaway from all of those different varying research studies that he did with these different parasites of things that could make you ill. So there we've got it, right? Coming back to those three main principles of the cell theory. All living things are composed of cells. We've pieced them all together. Cells are the basic units of life, the smallest pieces that make up a living thing. Just like atoms are the smallest pieces that make up matter, cells are the smallest pieces that make up living things. And all those living things are composed of cells. Could be one or many, but they're all composed of them. And lastly, cells come from previously existing cells. They don't just show up. There has to be a cell present first in order to make new ones. So we're going to stop there, do a little practice.